Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to kick off today's talk, and I'd really like to welcome you to the first in this year's series of What Economists Really Do. So this is a series where we're trying to provide kind of accessible introductions to topics at the forefront of economics. And you can find all the recordings so there will be this one, but you're here, but all the recordings of also our past events and the ones in the future are all on our YouTube channel. So I'm Abby Adams-Prassel. I'm a professor in the economics department at Oxford, and I'm associate head of department with responsibility for research impact and external engagement. And I'm completely delighted to welcome Professor Arun Advani, who's going to be talking to us about race-related research in economics. Now, Arun is an associate professor at the University of Warwick, as well as, I've got a long list here, okay? So a research fellow at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is actually where we met a very long time ago now, a visiting fellow at the International Inequalities Institute, and a member of the Department for Education, Skills and Productivity Board. Now, Arun is a real force for good and positive change within the economics discipline. He's the co-chair of the Discover Economics campaign, which is trying to increase the diversity of people who study and work in economics. And as of course we'll hear about today, a lot of Arun's research kind of touches on topics on inequality, both in terms of inequality within the profession, but of course far beyond that. So now in terms of format, Arun's going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we're going to turn over to all of you for questions. And please do post questions in the Q&A as we go, so then I can kind of I've got a little stock for when we finish. So that's all from me. Arun, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Abby, and thank you all for coming to hear about race-related research in economics. And so I was delighted when Abby asked me to come and speak at the session, because the What Economists Really Do area is really close to my heart. Trying to help explain to people what economics is about, what the huge range of areas we study is something I think is really important, and it's kind of crucial in actually getting more people involved in economics, because until people know what economists do, know the range of things we do, until you get them out of the mindset that what this is all about is sort of money and finance, it's really hard to get the full range of people who could be interested in our subject, who could be involved, to really kind of get on board. So I was sort of, looking back at all of the other sessions that you've had so far that, Abby's run, and there's this first one on the economics of biodiversity, which again, it's a hugely important area. There's lots that economists have to contribute, but it's not something that immediately springs to a lot of people's mind. There's stuff on the future of work, which, is Abby's work herself. There's work on cities, there's been work on gender gaps. So there's a huge range of different areas that economists are studying, and this is going to be one more. And actually, this one's going to be unusual as a talk, because I'm not going to talk about what economists have said about race and ethnicity. I'm going to talk about how we study what economists have said about race. So it's the economics of the study of ethnicity and race, which is sort of unusual, but is important, because if we don't know how much we're looking at the subject, if we don't know how much we're thinking about the subject, it's hard to know, is the amount we're doing the right amount? Is it the wrong amount? Are we focusing on the right areas? So we just want to understand, in this piece of work, we're trying to understand a bit of where we are, what is the current state of the world in economics in terms of the study of these kind of questions, and to get a sense for why, what is it that leads us to where we are? So the first thing, just, why should economists even be studying this? What do economists have to contribute? So, you hopefully will have seen from the broad range of other things that are out there, economics and the economic way of thinking has a lot to contribute to a lot of different types of subjects. Clearly, biodiversity, you might first think of a natural scientist sitting there looking, going out there and counting butterflies or trying to measure the melting of ice caps. But economists have lots to contribute to help you understand, actually, how do we get to where we are? What are the behaviors that lead people to taking us to where we are? What are the trade-offs? All of those things. That's true across a range of fields, and that's true even in the context of race and ethnicity. So we're really interested in understanding the behaviors that lead to what we see as outcomes. And so understanding what are the incentives that go into that. And those incentives don't mean money. They also mean money, but they mean other things. You might be motivated by cash, but you might also be motivated just by kind of prestige and social appreciation, that people are excited by you doing something. And so that's another extrinsic motivator for people. You might also have intrinsic motivation. We have our preferences. We're excited to work on topics because we think they're interesting. So economists are interested in understanding, why is it that people make the choices they do? And in the context of race and ethnicity, you might want to understand, why is it that we see, for example, individuals from certain backgrounds being more or less likely to go into some fields or go into certain kinds of jobs? Is it that there's some forms of discrimination that are there? And if so, what are the sources of that discrimination? What's the motivations for people to engage in that discrimination? Because actually, ultimately, there are choices that are going on in making those decisions, and how can we shift those? So that's a really important part of it. And that's clearly one strand of what's going on. Another thing is that economists have a really fundamentally quantitative approach. We're really interested in trying to measure things, to understand how they're happening, and to kind of look at that in a way that is different to what other social sciences are doing. Now, that's not to say anything negative about the approaches that other people are taking, but it means that economists have something distinctive to offer that's lost if you don't have economists involved in these questions. So one paper I really love came out, I think, 3 years ago, and it was studying the question of, and it'll come to actually what I'll say in a minute about efficiency, but it's studying the question of actually just looking over the last 60 years of growth in the US, how much of that growth is explained by getting women and people of color into types of jobs they weren't previously able to get into. So historically, it won't be a surprise to anyone here that there are lots of communities who've been marginalized, who haven't been had access to certain kinds of careers. Historically, they were just not even allowed to get into many of those things. And clearly, if we think that there are brilliant women as well as brilliant men, then we think there are brilliant people of color as well as brilliant white people. Having that kind of structure that says actually you're not allowed to get into this kind of job, even though you'd be amazing at it, you'd be really well suited at it. You could be, the next Einstein, but you're just not given the background and the context to be able to get there. Think about what's lost collectively to all of humanity by that kind of thing happening. And so this paper went and measured, actually how, we can use economic thinking and a bit of a model to try to understand quantitatively how much of growth that we have seen over the last 60 years has come just from that job of just doing better at letting people into those kinds of jobs. Now, it's not to say we're in the perfect situation now, but just to say we were a long way from perfect before, and now we're closer, we're moving in the right direction. And it said, something like 40% of all growth, of all of the increase in kind of people's well-being, people's ability to buy things, has come from better allocation of people, better allocation of resources, allowing people to get into those kinds of jobs. So it's not even trying to quantify yet the value to those people of being seen as equals, of all of those things that we should also value, but just for somebody who is, if you're trying to argue with a policymaker who's hard-headed and only cares about the numbers and trying to, make the budget balance, for them, showing, well, look how growth is coming from this, the tax revenue is coming from this. That's a motivation for a policymaker, and so that's kind of important. The other thing that we have to contribute is, the way that we think about things, we think about trade-offs, we think about these opportunity costs. What's lost by, if you make one choice, what are the things you're not choosing, and what's being lost by those? Making these things about efficiency. So this example I just gave of getting people into the kinds of jobs they might be best at. So those are all things that I think economists contribute. So this is all motivation to, I'm going to talk about what we study, but I think it's really important to understand why should economists take this seriously? Why should we think this is an important area? And the final thing just to say is economics is hugely policy relevant. Economists, whether or not people like it, end up having a seat at the table in policy making. There's a government in the UK, there's a government economic service, and there isn't a government sociological service or a government psychological service. So even if you think those other fields have lots to contribute, and I think that they do have lots to contribite, if you want to have an influence on policy, it does matter that this stuff is coming into economics as well, because economists are the ones who in the end come down, are asked to go and make those, give that advice. And it comes from the fact that the way that we think about the world is to say, we look at specific things that are happening and use them to try to generalize, because ultimately policy has to be somewhat general. And so because we're looking at generalizing somehow and trying to look for actionable solutions rather than just describing, that gives us a kind of seat at the table. So it's really important that economists are thinking out these issues. So that's, as I say, that's sort of wind up, but I think it's important, for me at least, is why I think it's really important that we are considering this kind of question. So when we ask a question like, how much do economists study something like ethnicity and race? So we'll look at that, and we'll also look at why. When we ask a question like that, we have to know, well, what does it mean to study ethnicity and race? We're going to have to, I told you we're fundamentally quantitative. So I'm going to have some way to define that. And as much as I'd love to go and read every single paper out there and kind of code them all up by hand, that's just not feasible. We just do not have the time to do that. And so what we did was first to kind of scrape data, to collect data on all of the papers that were out there in economics, going all the way back through history, back to the kind of late 1800s when there were first economic journals, and also to do this in a couple of other fields. So in psychology and in sociology, and in political science. So it's about 500,000 papers in total. So what does a paper look like? It looks like this. So this shows you a title of a paper, it shows you the authors, and it shows you the abstract, the first little introductory bit of a paper that tells you, what is this paper about? Here's a kind of summary of what we're talking about. And so this for us is what a paper looks like. It also we have some tags for what year it was published, what journal it was published in, and so on that we explore. But this is a paper to us. And so the first thing is just, what does the number of papers look like over time? This is showing you the cumulative number of papers that are, sorry, not cumulative, the number of papers in any given year, the number of papers that was published in each of these fields. And so you can see in economics, there's been a big growth. So in the early 1990s, there was a big increase in the rate of publishing in economics, and it's gone up. These declines at the end are just because the data in the most recent years, some of the data sets we access don't have all of the journals in. So that's all that decline is. It's not a real decline, and that's why I'll show you in a little while when I show you how much race-related work there is. I'll show it to you as a share of this total rather than as the total numbers only. But this is just to give you a sense for what do our data look like. We've got thousands of papers every single year, and this makes it clear to you why we can't go and read them all. And so what we're going to have to do is to find a mechanism, define a kind of rule to say, is this piece of research race related or is it not race related? So the rule that we picked was to take this kind of picture, to take the title and abstract and go through it and say, does it contain at least one race related keyword? In this case, we had a group keyword, and we have 4 of those kind of keywords. So for us, a group keyword is something that tells us this paper has something in it that relates to some kind of racial group. That could be just a generic keyword, as we call it. So that could be something like race or ethnicity or some other very general term, or it could be talking about specific groups. So it could talk about white or African American or Latino or Latina or Native American or any of a large list of things. And so here actually there's quite a few of them, and I didn't even kind of block out all of the ones that are repeated because race shows up quite a few times here. African American shows up a couple of times. But if a piece of research has this at least once, anywhere other than in the last sentence, because sometimes in the last sentence you have a kind of throwaway comment, oh, by the way, it doesn't differ by race or by ethnicity, and we didn't want to focus on that. We wanted to look at which papers were really taking seriously this question of race, where is it central? So the first thing is it has to contain one of those. The second is it has to have some kind of keyword telling us about a topic. And that helps us just narrow out some of the things where you end up with a word like race in the title or in the abstract, but we're really talking about a horse race, or we're talking about an arms race, or something that we know that's not race related in the sense that we mean it. It's not about ethnic groups and differences. It's or inequalities or about labor market outcomes. It's just about some other thing, and it happens to have a keyword. So having this combination helps us when we go through and we kind of hand check a small sample. It shows us that this is kind of a good measure for race related. This is what we're going to mean. So I'm not going to show you the full list of things, but group keywords, there are these non-specific ones. So there's things like race. This kind of stuff after it is telling you that it can be race or racial or racist or anything that's kind of 3 more letters, A to Z, coming after that. It could be person of color, spelled in different ways, ethnicity, and so on. There are then the specific ethnic groups, African American, which we have lots of different codes for. Latinx, again, we have lots of codes for. So I'm not showing you the full list here, but just to give you a sense for what are we looking for. We're looking for something like this, and then we're looking for something like this. Again, there's a long list. There's not to go into all of the details, but just to show you the sort of discrimination, inequality, diversity, identity. These are all different areas in which economists are studying, in which they think about race-related topics. And so for us, this is a way of trying to separate out things that have some other word in it, like horse race. But secondly, it's a way for us to then think about what the topics are, because one of the things we'll want to do later on when we're trying to understand differences between economics and other disciplines is understand, is that just because we study different topics, and that's sort of what's driving what's going on. And I'll show you something on that later on. So for us, that's what we mean by a race-related piece of research. Is it's got one of those group keywords, it's got one of these topic keywords, it may have multiple. And then from that, we can get, how much do economists study questions of ethnicity and race? And so this is showing you the number of publications each year, the number of new contributions to the sum of human knowledge that economists are making in each of these topics. And so you can see that, it sort of peaked as we can see it in 2010 at about 200. There are more, as I said, in these recent years that are not fully captured, because in the recent years, there are some journals that we haven't yet got. We're working on that. But at the moment, there's more recent years, not everything is available in our database. So you can see on the one hand, there is a kind of positive trend. That's good. But you also saw there was a positive trend in the total number of publications. So this isn't telling you that much just yet. The other is just, if you think in absolute terms, like how much new information is there in this area? there's not a huge, I mean, to me, this doesn't seem like a huge number of new pieces of research on a topic like this. So in terms of how much we're contributing to knowledge in this area, it's currently not a massive number in absolute terms. And I think those absolute terms do matter as well as the shares. So looking at it in shares instead, how does this compare to other disciplines? First, let's just look at economics on its own. It's less than 2%, fairly consistently across the entire period. We've done a bit of work updating this, so actually some newer results we have suggest it was slightly higher in this period than we show at the moment. But for now, I included this one because I've got the comparison here between economics and other disciplines. And so first, you can see for economics, it's been pretty flat. It hasn't really increased. It would be nice if it had increased, if we said, oh, we're going to work more on this, but we don't see that. It's hard to know what the right number should be. So there's a couple of ways in which I'm going to try to talk to you about that, because economists, we like to know what's going on, but we also like to have a sense for, is this big? Is this small? Is this the right number? What's optimal? Now, optimal is a really hard question here. I have no idea what optimal means. So I'll show you two things that I think are at least instructive in trying to understand and trying to parse this kind of number and think about it. So one thing I find really helpful is just to compare to what other disciplines do. That's kind of a reasonable benchmark. So we look at a couple of other social sciences that are kind of close to us. So we look at political science, which these days is quite often using similar methods to us. It's quite similar, often capturing some of the same kinds of questions as we are. Clearly, as I said earlier, there are some things distinctive about the way that we do things. And so questions like, how does the better allocation of people to jobs leads to growth? Is the kind of question I think only an economist would ask, and it's really an important question. But I think there are some questions that we overlap in. And you can see that political science is got about twice as many papers as a share of the papers produced as we do. Sociology used to be about 4 times as many, and it's gone up even more than that. So for sociologists, this is a really important part of what they study. A very large share, 1 in every 8 papers they produce is somehow related to race. So it's a much larger share. I'll come back to the question of why are there these differences between these fields. But before we do that, I wanted to show you a different way to think about this question. Because we looked at this and when I saw this, I thought, I mean, we produce less, but maybe we think that's fine. I mean, we do other things. We do econometrics, and econometrics is hard to make race related. Clearly, we do other, there's all the other kind of areas that we spend time thinking about. Maybe some of these are just quite hard, and maybe this just shouldn't be a surprise to us. We should just expect that we're going to produce less. So what we thought was, if we all are doing less research in race and ethnicity than other fields, but we all know this and we're all happy with this, that's fine. If it turns out we're doing less and that's not what we were thinking, that would be less good. So we would hope that at least we're self-aware as a discipline what we are actually doing. So these black lines here are showing you the shares in the kind of true values of those shares. This is what I showed you on that last graph, but just like taking an average of the years 2000 to 2020, just to give you a single number to look at. And we went out there and surveyed a bunch of economists. About half of them were academics, about half of them were in the policy space. And we asked them, okay, what share of research in economics do you think is race related? We showed them our definition, showed them our algorithm, all of those things, told them how we were doing this. We asked them, what share of research in economics do you think is race related? And then as a point of comparison, what do you think about political science? What do you think about sociology? And so these are the results. There's 3 things I want you to take away from these results. The first is as a profession, economists are really good at understanding that economists don't study this very much, that political scientists study it more, and sociologists study it even more. So we have that trend exactly right. If you look at the median among this group, you can see that trend is exactly right. So we kind of got those numbers right. That's well done us. The second is we were over predicting kind of consistently across the board. So the median is too high, the median is still too high, the median is still too high. So we also think there's a bit more race-related research out there than there actually is. But the third, which I think is really quite depressing, is how badly we overpredict and how much more unaware we are of our own discipline than other disciplines. So 60 to 70% of people economists overpredicted the share in sociology. More like 80% overpredicted the share in political science. Substantially more than 90% overpredict the share in economics. More than 9 out of 10 economists think there's actually lots more research out there that relates to race than there actually is. So they think it's out there somewhere. They're obviously not reading it because they would otherwise have a better sense for where it is. But they have this sense out there, race-related research is happening. And so I think that, in a sense, for me was, it seems like quite an important and powerful result to think about, because if this is kind of what economists think is out there, this is what we think is the equilibrium, and it's so far from what we're actually doing, that skews just our perception of how this work is going. And it's not just a general sense of overprediction. One thing you could say is, yeah, we think there's just more research out there. Maybe you'd ask people about a bunch of topics and collectively it would add up to more than one. And you'd say, okay, people just overpredict. But no, people overpredict much more in economics. Economists overpredict much more the share done by economists than they do in other disciplines. And so it really is the case that we're really bad in our own discipline at understanding how little of this research we produce. And so that suggests that maybe we are, not fully getting it right. We're not actually capturing appropriately a good understanding of what it is we're doing, and that maybe we should be doing more. So having said all that, it would be good to know, why is it that we're producing so little, frankly, research that is race related? So the first idea you might have, going back to that picture I showed you earlier, is, well, it's just the topics. We study different things. We study econometrics, we study all these other, there's other areas that we study, industrial organization. Some of these areas are much harder to make race-related, perhaps. Now, of course, we should then be aware that quite reasonably sociologists would come back to you and say, well, we also study this kind of abstract area of theory, and political scientists would say, well, we also study, interaction between countries, and those are things that are hard to make race-related as well. And so, actually, maybe those things should be a wash. So one thing we did was to say, okay, we have all these topic keywords that we've looked at. We've kind of measured what's the share of economics research that is that's out there that was race related, that was relates to discrimination. What's the share that relates to inequality and all of those things? So we said, suppose that economists kept publishing those same topics, just focus on those topics, the inequality, the discrimination, all of those areas that we looked at, and made in those topics, we published at the same, the share of that kind of research, the inequality related research, the share of it that was race related was the same as sociology. The share of discrimination that was race-related was the same as sociology, and so on. We show that if you do that, that would actually entirely close the gap between us and sociology. So it's not about the fact that we're just studying different kinds of topics, because even within topic, actually the chance that we are studying race in there is just much lower. And if you were to just equalize those chances of studying race, the share of that research that was race related, that would be enough to close the gaps in those areas. So it's not about just, well, we study topics that are different, because even when you look at those topics, we're studying it at a much lower rate. So the second idea is, we're economists, we like to think about demand, we like to think about incentives. Maybe there's just not much demand for this kind of research. Maybe the incentives aren't well aligned. And this is, intuitively quite an appealing concept. It's something that's out there quite often. People say, oh, well, it's the gatekeepers, it's the journals. They don't let this kind of research through. So this is kind of an interesting hypothesis. The nice thing is that you can go and test that kind of question. So we look at the set of papers that end up as working papers in a couple of different working paper series. So the NBR and the CEPR, those are big groups where, in the US, the NBR, and in Europe, the CEPR, are places where people put their working papers, their kind of drafts of academic research that they're planning to submit to an academic journal and eventually to get published. And we look at, what's the chance that stuff gets published in an economics journal, gets published in a top economics journal, gets cited, and so on. And when you look at those, how long does it take to publish? Across all of those things, there's basically no difference between race-related research and non-race-related research in terms of their chance of getting published in a good journal, getting published at a reasonable speed, a consistent speed across these different groups. The one difference that is out there is, if anything, race-related research actually is slightly more likely to publish in the top journals. So if anything, the incentives are aligned that you ought to be trying to produce more of this kind of research. So it's not really about the topics. It's not that we couldn't do it given the kind of work that we do. It's not really that, so it's not a constraint. It's not about demand. It's not that there isn't a demand out there for this kind of research. So the natural thing that's left for us as economists is supply. Is it about representation? The people who are out there who are able to produce, or who are motivated to produce this kind of research. Because, as I said, for us, incentives are both intrinsic and extrinsic. There are extrinsic incentives that come from what will get me published in a good journal, what will get me promoted, but there are also intrinsic incentives. What do I find motivating? What am I excited to spend my time doing? And so if you have a discipline that doesn't represent a broad range of people, that might be a source of gap between producing more of this kind of research and where we are today. So the first thing to look at then is it the case that different groups are differently likely to produce race-related research? And to that, the answer is a kind of resounding yes. I haven't put all kind of stars on here to show you significant differences, but these differences are significant, so at standard significance levels. So column 1 here is showing you for individuals who are white, who are not ethnic minority backgrounds, what share of them have any race-related publication. This is not across the entire of academics in the US. There's a sample we were able to get coded up of academics, and so in that sample we find that almost 1 in 5 academics have some race-related publication, but so the share of their publications overall that race-related is much lower. And then we can compare them to all minorities on average, but then we can also break down those minorities into 3 distinct groups. So we break them down into Black/African American, into Hispanic, and into an other category that catches all of the other groups that are out there. And what you can see is particularly individuals who are Black are much more likely to have at least 1 race-related publication, and are likely to have a much larger share of their publications that are race-related. So it is the case that people from different backgrounds are working on race-related research at different rates. So this is US evidence. At this point, I'll switch now to talking about some UK evidence on who actually is therefore represented in academia in the UK, and in specifically in economics in the UK, and think about how that's likely to change in the coming years or not. But this is just showing you that I think it is important. We're doing more work in this area, but it is important to think about who is represented. So this is work with other co-authors looking in the UK at how diverse economists are, and we did this looking at different stages of the economics pipeline. I'm not going to cover everything that we looked at today, so that the work is out there, but I want to pick out a few things that I thought were relevant for what we're talking about at the moment. So the first is, what share of academics come from ethnic minority backgrounds. So this is just showing you, not for economics, but just across for all individuals who are in academia, what share of them are in the Russell group. So for white individuals, almost half of academics in the UK are working at a Russell Group university. So for those who don't know, the Russell Group is a kind of loose collective of what you might think of as research-intensive universities. They're universities that actually tend to provide the amount of time. They're not the only ones that produce research, but they're ones where academics who work there typically will expect to have a chunk of their time available to spend time actually doing active research, to be producing these new contributions to knowledge that we were just talking about. And so this seems like a good place to kind of focus when we're trying to think about who is producing research in the UK. So you can see that this is the pattern across all of academia. Now, just showing you for economics specifically, you can see that white individuals are slightly in economics. White individuals are slightly higher, have a higher probability of being in the Russell Group than is true kind of consistently overall. And other backgrounds are either kind of similar, or in particular, there's some groups that are much less likely to be represented in the Russell Group if they're in economics than elsewhere. So economics has a bit of a problem. It's different to, so one problem you could just say is, like, looking across all academics, it's already the case that this is not equal. It's already the case that people who are from Indian and Chinese backgrounds are slightly more likely to be in the Russell Group than people from white backgrounds, and people who are Pakistani or Bangladeshi heritage or who are Black are less likely to be represented, quite substantially less likely to be represented in the Russell Group. But then when you look at economics, there's actually an economic specific problem on top of that we're even worse at that. So these gaps that were already there are even bigger when you look at economics. And so that I think is important for us to recognize, because I think sometimes we do rely on saying, well, academia is not that representative. There are all kinds of problems, and there absolutely are. And there are lots of things that should happen at kind of overall level to fix that. But part of the problem is us. It is within economics. So one natural question is, how much of that is driven by the pipeline? The students, you guys, because many of the people who will be watching this are students, is driven by who is getting into economics in the first place. So let's go look at undergraduates. We have results on other stages of the academic process. As I say, I won't show you today, but feel free to look for these papers if you're interested, and you'll find more about it. And I wanted to show you a bit also. I've been just talking about ethnicity so far, but I think diversity goes beyond that, and I'll talk a bit more about that at the end. So I wanted to show you kind of breakdown by men and women here as well. So the first thing that's really striking, and I think again is pretty well known, is that economics is very unequal by sex as well. So this is by self-reported sex, and men from all ethnic backgrounds are much more likely to be represented than women are. It's incredibly large. This is across the whole of undergraduates in economics, but across the country. And this is what you can see. So there's big gaps between men and women. That's really quite striking. When you look by ethnic minority background, you can see actually, if anything, white individuals are less likely to go and study economics than most other ethnic minority backgrounds. So that might make you think, okay, well, this problem is going to go away. We see this gap that I showed you earlier, but actually with more non-white individuals, particularly with more Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and individuals from Black backgrounds who are studying economics, maybe that will close some of that gap later. I should add as a caveat, by the way, I couldn't break down Black into other groups earlier on when I was showing academics, because there are so few Black academics in the UK that we're not allowed to break it down into these different categories, which is in itself pretty depressing. So this is what we see across undergraduates. But again, there are different universities, and this is not to say anything kind of about which universities are better or worse in any kind of wider sense, but there are some universities where people are more likely to be able to get onto that kind of research track. If you go to a research intensive university, it's much easier to get into a path where you could go off and study a master's or PhD and eventually become an academic if that's what you want to do. There are clearly other things to go and do, but if we're thinking about research and how we get economists to produce more race-related research, having understood that it's actually by getting people from a wider range of backgrounds involved, we need to think about, well, who's actually likely to be able to get involved. So this is showing you for the Russell group, again, so this comparison of who gets into the Russell group. So the blue bar is showing you so forget the orange for a minute. I should have shown this 2 steps, but forget the orange for a minute. The blue is showing you across all subjects, not just economics, what's the share of undergraduates from that background who are in the Russell group. And so because the numbers are quite different for all subjects and for economics, I've normalized this to 1 for white individuals. So you can kind of compare, you can use white as a kind of comparison thing for all of the limitations that comes from doing that. And you can see that, individuals who are Indian background or Chinese background are more likely to make it to the Russell group across all subjects than people from white backgrounds. Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, people who are Black are less likely to make it into the Russell group. Those patterns, again, are even more stark for economics. So where we see this overrepresentation, if anything, for Indians and Chinese, when you're looking across the Russell group, when you look at it for economics, that drops away quite substantially. And again, for the groups who are least well represented as academics, those are the groups that are least well represented at the undergraduate in the Russell group. So Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, people from people who are Black. The picture is still pretty stark. And so the sad news from this is that it's not the case that these are gaps that are just going away. So finally, where are these gaps coming from? What is kind of the driving force that leads to us having these big gaps? Well, one important part of it is access to economics at school. If you speak to anyone who teaches at university, will tell you that we don't need you to have studied economics at school. It's just not important to us that you studied it at school. We will teach you everything from scratch. It's not that the A level basically doesn't matter for when you come to a university. And the evidence is that if you didn't study A level, you will catch up by the end of term 1 with anyone who did study A level. So there's really no downside in that way. But students are paying large fees to go off and study a subject at university. And if they don't know that subject exists, or they don't really know what it's about, it's really hard to be motivated to go and study that. And that's one of the reasons I think this series that Abby's been putting together on what economists really do is so important as a way of communicating to people what is out there, what does economics about, what are the opportunities you have with economics, and why you might want to do it. But at the moment, the A level in economics exists in about half of comprehensive schools. It exists in 80 to 90% of private and grammar schools. And that huge gap in access to economics creates a huge gap in who studies economics at A level. And that gap, so that's on the left-hand side here, and that gap in who studies at A level basically feeds through to who studies at undergraduate. That's on the right-hand side. So there's a scale difference here because not everyone who studies at A level studies it at university, but you can see that it's roughly a kind of 1 in 4 ratio. So roughly people do about 4 A levels, 3 to 4 A levels, and roughly 1 in 4 chance they go on to study economics if they studied it earlier, which is kind of consistent with what you might expect. And so this difference in studying at A level is really crucial. And that's why it's really a shame that we don't have better access to A-level economics, and why it's important for those of us who are involved in economics and think it is an important thing, to get people involved in, communicate what it's about and try to sort of disintermediate the A-level, to go around the A-level and help people get into economics, should they be excited by it, even without access to the A-level. Because when you apply to university, no university cares whether or not you had access to A-level, or whether you studied at A-level. And so, this is just picking up a couple of things that I've said that relate to what I've said already before I wrap up, but just a few reasons why I think representation really matters, why it's important to solve these problems. So one is representation affects the questions that we ask, and that's kind of what I've been showing you for most of the talk today. I've shown you that it really matters who is involved, because that affects the kinds of questions we ask and therefore the kind of research we produce. And that will eventually feed through into policy, because when policymakers look for answers to questions, or even look for what are the things that we should be trying to tackle, they're not going there and reading every academic journal end to end, but they are thinking about, well, what is it that people are studying and who is there out there to advise us and tell us what things are important. So academia and academic research really matters in that way. And if we don't have a representative set of people in academia, it's going to affect the questions that we ask and the kind of answers we're able to give. There are also reasons, just for plain legitimacy, frankly, that it's quite reasonable in civil society to say, well, I want the set of people who are decision makers to somehow represent the population that decisions are being made about, and that's certainly not the case at the moment. And that's a kind of core reason why actually we do need to just tackle this problem head on. But there are also other instrumental reasons. So there's good evidence in economics about the quality of decision making being affected by the amount of diversity out there. There's evidence about the kind of conclusions that are reached being affected by the diversity that's out there. And so there are a number of things that economics is teaching us. This is just to wrap up. Economics is thinking about this. Economics teaches us that diversity actually does matter for various kinds of outcomes. And so it is really important to think about that and to expand diversity, not just for the other reasons that I've been showing you today. So what can be done to change things? One is for us to study this kind of question more. So this is just advertising a new project that we've got going. We've run out of the LSE, but with people from UCL, from IFS, from a number of institutions being represented. It's called Diversity and Productivity in Education in the Workplace, where we're really taking an end-to-end view of diversity and thinking at how does diversity at different stages of the education system and universities and going into the workplace affect the kind of decisions that are made, the quality of what's going on. How do interventions in education, in the education system, change the pool of people who go on to study subjects, including economics in particular, because I have an interest in that. But to go and study, this is my example of a thing I'm doing, but we need more people to be studying these questions, because if we're not studying these questions, we can't come up with policy solutions. We need to be asking what's going on if we're going to make changes. But I wanted to just end on a bit of a high. And so, one is, this is an example of the European Central Bank has recently, has about 10 years ago actually now, got involved in an intervention which they used that there's good evidence reduced the gender pay gap that was there, and promotion gap. And that what they did was to go and again do a bit of internal research, trying to understand what was going on. And they looked at why there were these gaps, and they saw that one of the big reasons for a gender promotion gap was that men were going up for promotion, were requesting promotion sooner. And in many cases, it was that there were plenty of women who were kind of eligible and plausible candidates, but they weren't putting themselves forward. And also sometimes they weren't putting themselves forward. And when men would put themselves forward, they might get knocked back, but they learned something from that process that meant their application the next year was stronger. And so what they did was have this intervention where they said, okay, what we should do is to actually provide some mentoring to encourage people to put themselves forward, but also to have an automatic process by which you're basically required to put yourself forward after a certain number of years. That was earlier than you're likely to get through, but you have to submit a case and you'll be considered automatically. And the upside of being considered automatically is that it then didn't feel like you're putting yourself out there and saying, I'm necessarily wonderful and brilliant. But those differences, that has noticeably closed not removed, but noticeably closed the gender promotion gap. So that was a case where research was actually informative in changing, what actual behavior was actual policy and has had outcomes. So it's just to say that research really matters. Government economic services is an area that hires a lot of economists. It's one of the biggest hirers of economists in the UK. They've now got an apprenticeship scheme. That's a new way into economics. It's not a way that's going to help with the research side of things, but it's an important additional route into economics and into policy, which I think is crucial. And I'm keen to kind of get it advertised out there because it's really important. And the final example I wanted to give was Discover Economics, which, as Abby said, is a charity that I co-founded and co-run. And it's a campaign to increase diversity, getting students into undergraduate. What I showed you earlier was that there's this big gap in terms of who studies at A-level that basically comes from, who studies at university that comes from the A-level and access to the A-level. So what the campaign is about doing is trying to widen the pool of people who go and study by going out there directly with and contacting students in schools to tell them about economics and tell them they don't need to have done the A-level, providing events online, doing other kinds of things that help people get around the fact that the A-level is really not essential in getting into university. We're also working on trying to increase the number of teachers who are able to teach the A-level, but the key message is, even if you don't study A-level, if you know somebody who's not studying economics at A-level, but who might be interested in economics, make it clear to them. None of us care about whether they studied that before. But if you're listening to this and you're already studying economics and you're interested in getting involved in the campaign, please go to the website or go to the Twitter / Instagram / TikTok. We're on all of the socials and get involved. We're really keen to hear from people who are studying economics and who want to get involved in promoting our messages. So on that note, I will leave it there and head back to Abby.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was kind of that combination of really fascinating and really depressing. I guess I wouldn't as well. I would have been pretty pessimistic in terms of the share of publications being race related, but yeah, I wouldn't have been at 2%. So thanks so much for that. So I think there are kind of at the moment two kind of sorts of questions which are coming up. Some is kind of more kind of clarification around like the work that you were doing. So I think maybe we'll start with those and then we'll kind of transition into the kind of maybe like some more kind of bigger picture stuff. So there's one question about kind of, so at the moment you're measuring whether a paper is race related essentially by what's coming up in the abstract, and there's you might so kind of a question about are we missing, especially in economics, things where race is potentially a central part of analysis later on because of the way that the data is being used, even if it's like the question being asked isn't specifically about race. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about how you kind of thought about that measurement point.
Yeah, no, so it's a really important point. I mean, I think measurement is the key question to ask about in a paper where we're trying to measure and tell you, how much race-related research is there out there. So it's a kind of the perfect kind of question to be thinking about. I mean, for us, if you're an academic writing papers, you want very quickly in your abstract to tell people what is the question you're asking and what are the answers you're finding, what are the key things that you discover. So if something related to race is an important part of what you're finding, if that's kind of one of the central messages you want people to take away, then you would have it in your abstract. In a sense, also, if you bury it somewhere deep down in the paper and you don't have it in your abstract, given that academics are all very busy, a lot of people will come across your paper and will read the title and the abstract and maybe read the introduction and not have time to kind of engage with all of the details because there are too many, as I showed you, there are 8,000 papers a year being produced in economics. So we can't read all of those. And so if you're not kind of highlighting up there, then even if race was actually a core part of what you were doing, that's not something that in the end other people are probably going to get as a message from you. So I think there are a few things that I worry about in terms, well, not worry about, but where I think we're sensitive to the measurements. We do try different things in terms of exactly which keywords we use, exactly how we blackball certain kinds of things, or explicitly removing things like horse race and arms race, and there are other ones like that. But I think the kind of reliance on using the abstract, I think, is not my biggest worry, because I think if it's an important part of the paper, it should really be in the abstract.
Yeah, no, I think that I would tend to agree. Having anyway at the moment trying to the restrictions now on the lengths of abstracts also really make you think about actually what the core question, what the kind of core contribution is. The other there are another couple of questions relating to that table that you had about the variation in the variation across different minority groups in their propensity to write race-related research. And so there are some questions about, do you have any hypotheses about that variation within, if you like, within minority, across minority groups? And is there anything that you've done in terms of across different fields potentially within economics, where those people are kind of publishing as well?
Yeah, so there's two great questions. So in terms of the kind of hypotheses for why we see those differences, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. So one is, and we see basically that Black individuals are much more likely to work in this area than, as you saw, than people from other ethnic minority backgrounds in the US. I mean, one obvious reason that you might be interested in that is if people are motivated to work on people like themselves, people with similar backgrounds, then Black individuals are one of the both historically largest, but also kind of most kind of sinned against, as it were, groups in the US. The history of slavery and the history of kind of other laws, post-slavery, Jim Crow laws and other rules mean that there's been lots of disadvantages for Black individuals, and it would be natural for that to be something that if you were from the background you want to study, it doesn't mean other people shouldn't want to study it, but as we said, people are often intrinsically motivated to study questions that are close to their heart. I spend time studying this because I think this is important. And so I think for a similar reason, it's probably not surprising that Black individuals are more likely to study, their race-related research is more likely to be about Black individuals. That's also true across other ethnic minorities, that they're more likely to study people who are more like them. And so in that sense, that sort of drives some of the difference. The other question was about fields. It's something we're looking at the moment. We haven't got all the results on that done, but it's something we're looking at the moment. Is we've done some work looking at the different topics that are studied, but looking at what the fields are, which we can get from. So if you remember that abstract I showed you at the end, there was a few little small codes at the end, which are these things that we call JEL codes, General Economic Literature. Helps you has a coding system that lets you classify the topics and the kind of fields that you're in as a researcher, or this paper's in, and so we use that to do some classification. But I don't have those results to hand. It's something we're still working on.
Yeah, thank you. And this is something, perhaps the point about representation, you're not going to be surprised about a question I'm about to ask now, which is about gender. So there's a question that's come up, which is kind of, well, okay, I'll just actually say it. So in your presentation, you link representation with interest in research on race. And do we know if that's similar, if we think about research on gender, or research, if you like, on the intersection of race and gender as well? I was thinking during your presentation as well, just in terms of benchmark, like kind of as well, like, obviously we're not going to get to the optimal number or the right number. And then I've got a follow-on question, which I was going to say now, which is so I did some work as a specialist advisor to the Equalities Select Committee a couple of years ago, and a bunch of things came up around gender pay gap reporting, and should we be expanding gender pay gap reporting to also include, for example, ethnicity pay gap reporting. And an issue, something that got brought up was about kind of data, and also, is it easier to measure gender versus like kind of race and ethnicity? It's not my area of expertise, but I was wondering if as well does that kind of play into perhaps potentially that mapping between, if you like, the representation or the identity of the researcher and actually what research they're doing.
Yeah, so on that second question of like what's easy to measure, what's kind of more and therefore how does that kind of tie in? I mean, I think it certainly is the case that it's easier to measure. I mean, notwithstanding the discussions about kind of gender and kind of gender fluidity, it is the case that certainly historically there was only two classifications that were allowed in data sets, whether or not that was the appropriate way to do things.
Yeah.
And so that made it relatively easy to think of there just being men and women, and therefore that was reported in actually most administrative data sets as well as most survey data sets. It's the kind of thing that is reported. So it's sort of in some sense easier to measure that way. And that matters both from a policy standpoint, that it's measurable, so you can do reporting based on it, and on a research standpoint, people could ask questions about that and do research on that because it's more directly measured. There are many fewer data sets, even though there are still quite a few, but there are fewer data sets that have ethnicity data. So actually, although I'm here talking to you all today about race and ethnicity, the kind of main area of research that I tend to work in is actually tax and inequality, and trying to use tax administrative data to measure inequality and look at how we can use the tax system in the short term to close some of those gaps, and in the long term look at parts of the skill system in education, which is sort of the tie into this. And in tax data, we don't have any information on ethnicity.
Yeah.
And so clearly you kind of can't ask a question just based on that data, because the data just don't exist. There's no way to look at the pay gap in that data by ethnicity, kind of at an aggregate level across the country. You could do that by sex. So that's the answer to that part. On the first question of, is it the case that there's, I can't remember what the question was now.
Oh no, it was just, do you know anything about what the share, for example, of gender-related research is in economics? I mean, it's definitely a lot higher.
Yeah, it's a lot higher. We did look at it. I now can't remember what the number is though, off the top of my head, so I don't want to say a number that's just wrong. But I mean, it is the case in a similar way. It is the case that women are more likely to work on gender-related things, which again, sort of maybe is not that surprising, because clearly women can work on all kinds of topics, but they may be more motivated to think about this kind of discrimination than men are, the same way and inequalities and other things that fit into this area than men are, because people tend to study things that they're interested in, and those are gaps. Those are issues that people might be just more aware of some of the differences, and anecdotally think about them, and then think, okay, now let's go study it, in a way that people who haven't had those experiences won't think, oh, this is something I want to get started on, and I won't realize there's something to study in the first place. I mean, actually, just as a quick aside, there's now a famous paper in the US looking at the innovation done by Black people, and looking after the civil rights era, the fact that there were communities in which there were riots, basically, and people had stuff appropriated from them. People who were Black had stuff appropriated from them, how that affected their willingness to go on and kind of invest and do more. And the reason that was a piece of research that was done is because the person who was writing the research had experience of that. They knew from their family history that this was a thing that happened, and that changed. They could tell a story internally of, like, I know the incentives that mattered for a particular set of people I know. Did that translate to something global or not? And you wouldn't know that's a question to ask unless you have that some experience of it that would make you think of that. And so I think that's a sense in which there just are lots of questions out there. That's why representation matters, is because there are lots of questions out there, lots of phenomena out there to explore that economists can and should want to explore, but we can't if we just don't know the questions there to be asked, and we don't know something there to do.
No, I think, and yeah, anyway, it's wonderful. I was sitting there being like, yes, I agree. I'm going to move on for like the last couple of minutes into, if you like, some things not so much about your paper, but kind of how it's like, what we do about it, the final part of your talk. So one question is also relating to, I guess, what we can do in universities. So I completely take the point that, in a sense, if we think about pipelines, we really need to think about schools, and and I think there's a gender issue here as well, in terms of it's not just finance that you can do if you're studying economics. But do you know of any examples? So the question is basically about, like, do you know of any examples of how undergraduate curricula have changed, perhaps to kind of have more race-related research, or where might there be, when you look at the kind of the teaching provision which is currently happening in UK universities, where would you push what would you suggest people look at, basically, to get more of a sense of where that research is coming up?
Yes, there's a few different kind of angles on that question that I want to pick up. So one is, where is the problem in the UK? And it's something I was going to flag because I think it comes up because the US story is a bit different. It's in the US, there's this description often of a leaky pipeline, which is that there's a set of people who at the start kind of get into economics. Some of them go, some people do it at school, some of them go from there to doing it at university, fewer of them stay in economics, and so on. And that happens partly because once you get into university to study, you're not studying a particular subject, you're studying a range of things, including economics. And then it's the case that women and to some extent ethnic minorities are less likely to continue studying economics. And so there's a lot to do then in trying to change how the curriculum is structured when people get in, to encourage people to stay. And so there's evidence from Raj Chetty's work where he changed the way that the introductory economics course was taught. And there's good evidence that that shifted the set of people who stayed, because he started with examples and talking about what we do, rather than a sort of more theoretical opening that's sort of, here's what economics could offer you, but without giving you exactly. So that's one thing. But I mean, in the UK, that's not the way that the world we live in, right? So in the UK, people get in to study a particular subject, and so actually the biggest problem is getting people from school to university. And so I think a big part of what universities need to be involved in is outreach work that gets students who aren't considering economics to be aware that economics exists and to understand better. And there's a program that we're doing at Discover Economics, which is working with universities, and I think more universities should get engaged with that. Quite a lot are, actually. So that's one thing to say. The other is in terms of, well, what could you still do better at universities? Because there are still things we could do better. I mean, one, I say when we talk about kind of changing the curriculum, we're thinking about the curriculum, there's sort of three steps I think of. The first one, which is so obvious that it's sort of amazing that it's actually a thing we have to keep saying, but actually when you go and look at the examples that are in there, in like completely hypothetical examples of people playing a game or doing something in a game theory lecture, for example, it's still the case that more than half of the names, quite substantially more than half of the names, are men. And those names are typically names that are associated with white people. And so those, it isn't the case that even our made up examples are representative. Like, that seems like a fairly straightforward thing to change. Similarly, the kinds of examples we use, we don't always have to use sports, which, we know, men and women can both like sports, but we know that, on average, more men are interested in, say, football than women are. So pick examples that are going to be more widely applicable and people are going to find more interesting. And actually, frankly, just pick some real world examples, because there are actually plenty of interesting things we are studying. So when we're thinking out a prisoner's dilemma game, pick something that actually relates to the real world where it's actually relevant, and that will make it more interesting for people and help them see the point of it. So that's, just those theoretical things are a good place to start. Then the next one to do is, actually, there is a lot of research done by people from different backgrounds. So when you have options of who to be citing and which papers to send people to go and read, do think about that a bit, think about those examples. And that includes also, when we have lectures on, say, labour markets, we talk about labour markets and we focus on labour markets in high income countries. We talk about public economics, we talk about it in high income countries. We talk about whatever else, we talk about high income countries. And then there's this box at the end that's development economics, which is all of the other subjects, all of those subjects we've discussed, but just in low income and middle income countries. And that's, again, not great. Like, at least at Warwick, we're lucky to have a huge diversity of students, including people from lots of other countries. And we try to make sure that in those normal lectures, we are, in those standard field courses, we're covering what does a labour market look like in a range of countries? What does public economics look like in a range of countries? And that matters because also it helps you think about some of the constraints that don't seem obvious to people because they don't realize that those things are different across countries. So that's the second thing you do. Then the third one is there are a set of topics we could talk about that we don't very much at the moment. So things like in macro and growth, thinking out what the role of slavery was, and thinking out what the role of colonialization was. If people are interested in that, actually, Discover Economics in collaboration with Cage is about to put out some videos on some of those topics, and so those will be coming out over the next month or so, and those will be really, I think they're a good resource for people who are teaching, and if you're not teaching but you're just studying and your teachers are not using them, you can still go watch those videos, and they're sort of 10 minutes each, helping you think about the role of some of these other aspects in how we get to where we are today economically.
That sounds wonderful. So just for so people who are watching, so we're gonna, this video will be posted on YouTube, but we'll also, I can also make sure that we try and post some of these links as well to make sure that everyone can get to Discover Economics and can get to the Cage website. So in the last 2 minutes, there are kind of, in a sense, there's a couple of questions here which are about like after the research, because as you were saying, we have a government economic service, we don't have a government sociological service, for better or for worse, and economists are very influential when it comes to thinking about policy making. And so do you know of anything which also relates, if you like, this lack of diversity within economics and economics research to the types of policies that then governments formulate in terms of which groups are favoured and which groups aren't? And the other question I wanted to put into that one was, do you think the policies implement, like some policies in this space, the person who's asking the question is suggesting, have focused on white versus non-white, and again, kind of not really actually engaged with this heterogeneity and differences across all, like, various different groups within the non-white category. And like do you, as well, I guess it's like at that point about how do you think representation plays into that? How much do you think that's a problem? Like, do we know, or do we even know enough about this, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, on the second one, I think, some of the results I showed you, where we kind of show you by ethnic minority, you see these very big differences. I mean, that's specifically in the context of studying economics, but you can see that people from Indian and Chinese backgrounds are actually slightly more likely to study it than people from white backgrounds, whereas people from are more likely to get into top universities, to study it, and people from Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and black backgrounds are less likely to get into those Russell Group universities that let you go on to study, and go and research this further. And so there are really important differences by sort of background that go beyond just saying white to non-white. So I think it certainly is the case that we need to move beyond that in terms of the way we think about the problem, in terms of where has that showed up in policy at the moment, and where is policy making use of these things. I mean, I think it's difficult. I think there's a sort of separate question. Once we understand these differences, there's then a kind of social acceptability question of, like, do we want policy to condition directly on race? Do we want policy to say, well, your background actually directly matters and we're going to treat people differently based on that? Or do we want to have ethnically neutral policies? I think that's kind of a question that then goes beyond the economics of it, and it's a question of, socially, what are we happy to see? I mean, you can see that there are these big differences across groups. It maybe is hard for a neutral policy to kind of close those gaps in a short period of time, but it's not an easy question, I think. And I think that's where, again, having more people be informed about what is the current situation puts us collectively in a place where we can have a discussion about that, and whether policies that are not neutral in that way are useful. I don't have a strong view on what the right answer on that question is, but I think it is a question that then goes beyond the economics. That's why more people need to be aware of it, so they can at least engage with what we find currently, and therefore what we might want to do about it.
That is, yeah, no, great point. And okay, we're out of time, sadly. So there are many more questions. I'm apologies to those that I didn't get to. I was trying to kind of group them into similar topics. But Arun, that was really fascinating, really inspiring as well. I think there's a lot that we need to do in Oxford. So we're hoping to engage with a lot of the diversity economics programs. But as you said, there's a whole range of other things that we can and should be getting involved with. In terms of next topics on this What Economists Really Do series, we're going to be tackling a UK macro policy. Nothing to talk about there in a couple of weeks, and this recording should be up in a couple of days on the YouTube site with links included. So again, thank you again, Arun, and yeah, I'm looking forward to saying thank you in person in a couple of weeks when I see you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks everyone.